this is the solution to barriers. And so my frustration at the moment is hearing adults in power who make those decisions to understand this. I know from experience, I know what I suffered as a child. I'm not suffering anymore as a deaf person, but I know that there are still deaf people out there who suffer. And I know that one of the solutions is to teach hearing children sign language, so when they meet deaf adults in the future, they know what to do.
Welcome to One in Tribe. I am your host, Julie Fidalgo. And today's very special guest is Feras Al-Moubayed, a Syrian born in Kuwait and currently living in UK. Firas is a passionate British Sign Language teacher and advocate for the deaf community. He was diagnosed as deaf at the age of 2, and although raised facing many challenges, Firas became the first deaf person to earn a degree at Liverpool John Moores University. In 2018, Firas established his own company, AMB Deaf Accessibility, with the mission of educating the public of deaf awareness and building a bridge between the hearing and deaf world. Firas, I too am on a mission to building a bridge between the East and the West. So we've got some work to do. I also have Jill Blackadder, who is a qualified and registered BSL, British Sign Language, interpreter, who has been working as an interpreter since 2015 and has been working with Firas since 2021. Welcome, Firas and Jill, to One in Tribe.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. And well done for remembering all of that detail. Well done.
I have notes.
You're a professional, consummate professional.
Thank you. Firas, I always like to start at the very beginning. Please tell me a little bit about your background and the initial years of your life.
Right. So my parents are Syrian, originally from Syria, from the most beautiful city. But I was born in Kuwait, as you mentioned, and I have 3 brothers who were born in Kuwait, 2 brothers who were born in Syria. My father set up his own textile business in Kuwait, which is why some of us were born there. And when I was born, I was hearing, no problems at all. But as you said, I became deaf at age 2. My parents noticed that there was something going on with my hearing around age 2. They took me to the doctor who diagnosed my deafness. And at that time, doctors weren't great at explaining to my parents or to the family around the possibilities and future for deaf people. Basically, at that time, they were told, oh, that's it, you're deaf, they'll never work, no future for this guy. And my parents didn't quite accept that. They spent a long time trying to teach me, nurture me, and so I continued to go to school in Kuwait until aged 9 when my parents realized that I was really behind. I was very isolated, being teased a lot, and I didn't know what was going on really. So my parents made the very difficult decision to send me away out of the Middle East for my education. I think they realized that the stigma attached to being deaf in the Middle East was something very difficult to overcome. And so I arrived in the UK with my father and my uncle when I was aged 9. And I had no idea what was going on, where we were going, and what for. So I arrived in the UK, and the first school that I went to is based in Brighton in the UK. It's called Hamilton Lodge. They accepted me, even though I had absolutely no English, no Arabic, and no sign language of any design. And they realized that I would be able to learn. And so for me, this was the beginning of my journey, for me to see other deaf people, deaf adults. People were learning, people were communicating. In where I'd grown up in Kuwait and Syria, everything was oral, everybody would speak, nobody would use their hands. So for me, this was an absolute mind-blowing experience where I realized that I could learn language, that I could learn to write, to read, and that's how I developed myself as a human being, as Firas, because I wasn't alone anymore. I had friends, I had adults, I had, you know, people who saw me as quite exotic. I think when they saw me that and they realized I was from the Middle East, they would be like, "What are you doing here? You're from the Middle East. You must be really rich. You come from oil. Why are you here?" And so for me, despite the difficulty of that original leaving of everything I knew to come to the UK, I have to really say thank you to Hamilton Lodge because they saved my life because of their acceptance of me. That was my first step into the deaf world. And that was the basis for my education. I then moved to a different school in Preston for 6 years and then in Derby to do my further education. And I left college when I was 17. And at that point, I went back to Kuwait because I wanted to be with my family. Spent my life in the UK from age 9 to 17 being alone. I'd complain a lot to my family about it, but my father would be really patient with me and say, "You have to be patient too. This is an investment for your future. You will have a better life because of this experience." And so I went back to Kuwait and decided that I'd work with my father. I wanted to learn with my father. I was the first brother that would be responsible for managing the business, for taking over the accounts, the sales, the marketing, orders. So for 2 years, I worked alongside my father. I really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic experience. But at the same time, alongside of that, the attitude towards deafness as a disability had not changed. So there was still a big barrier for me in terms of communication and attitude. Nobody there spoke English. In the UK, I'd had this really positive experience of what your future could be like as a deaf person. And then I'd gone to Kuwait where I couldn't see that future. And so I had a conversation with my father who asked me what I wanted to do. And I said that I wanted to go back to the UK, but I was really worried about financially what that would be like. And my father said, "Don't worry about the money. Don't you worry about that side of things. I have 3 other boys at this point who will be able to help me with the business. You need to go back to the UK." And so I went back to the UK and accepted the offer from John Moores University in Liverpool. I also got an offer from a university in London, but ultimately they rejected my application because I was deaf. I think at that time, despite Kuwait's attitudes, the UK's attitudes were better, but they weren't what they are now. John Moores, however, took a chance on me. And so I studied there for 3 months as on a trial basis. And after the 3 months, they said, "Oh, you're doing really well. You are clearly somebody who knows textiles. You have the wealth of knowledge around this." And obviously, this came from my father. My father was, very happy. I was able to work alongside the various students and work with all the different types of fabric. My dad was able to teach me everything I'd learnt, when, whether it was things like just burning the edge of the fabric and being able to identify it from its texture or from the smell that it made. Um, so I stayed in Liverpool. I continued my degree. I was there for 4 years. This is not something that I'd expected. And for me, in the end, to finally get that degree, that certificate, to graduate, it was finally worth it for all of the sacrifices that my father had made, because not only was he having to pay for my education, my fees, and also for my boarding, he also had to cover the cost of note takers and interpreters for me, because at the moment in the UK, we have something called a disability student allowance, which means that there is funding available for deaf students. But at that time, none of this existed. So my dad had footed the bill for my 4-year education, and to be the first deaf person to graduate was such an honor.
Wow. And were you the only deaf person at the school at that time?
I was the only one at that time. I was the only one. I have a very, very clear memory. So when I'd been in Preston, I think age 12 maybe, one of the teachers had come up to me and said, "I've got great news from your family. Your parents have said that you have a new baby in the family." And his name is YL, and this is his sign name. So, age 12, I realized that I had a new brother, and they said to me, he's also deaf. And at that point, I was furious. I don't know why. I was very young. I don't know why I reacted the way I did. I was like, oh no, I don't want him to be deaf. I don't want him to have the same experiences I've had. I don't want him to face the barriers and have the same struggles that I've had. And I stormed off, and the teacher didn't know what was going on, who then called my father, and my father then called me to say, no, no, no. My father then came to see what was going on, gave me a big hug, and, would sort of knock me on the top of his head and say, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? You know, what, you've got to wake up. Don't worry. Your brother is absolutely fine. You've got three hearing brothers who have each other for company. You are the only deaf boy in the family. Now you have a deaf brother, so the two of you will be together. And that's exactly what happened. So, during my studies and eventually ended up sort of with my brother, and we now live together. So my dad was absolutely right. Although I was the only deaf person at university, I got this deaf brother, and everybody remembers us. When I go back to Kuwait or Dubai or Syria, they always remember us. Oh, you're the two brothers who sign. And I think for me, if I'd been on my own, I might not have been as willing to sign in public. But with the two of us there, we give each other confidence.
That's amazing. I think you must have such a special relationship, the two of you. I can't imagine the bond that you two have.
Oh, incredible. I think, I was very young. So my father tried to plan for a while to join me here in the UK, but unfortunately, the finances at that time were very difficult. So Kuwait had gone through two wars, and business struggled. And my father had said that he wanted me to be able to support YL. And my father had explained, you know, that we know that it's the best thing for YL to have you as the role model. He's going to learn from you so much quicker. I'm here for YL, and that was definitely the plan. But unfortunately, then in 1994, my father passed away. I was absolutely heartbroken. But at the same time, I look back now and realize that he was right in everything, and sending me to the UK and sending me back to university. So I was 21 when that happened, and I immediately brought YL over to be with me. It was a massive responsibility. You're both mother and father to this young boy, but it worked out really, really well in the end. There were six schools that he was able to pick. He went to a school that was very different to mine. So both of them were in Brighton. Hamilton Lodge was a school that used sign language, and the school that YL picked was also in Brighton, called Ovingdean, but they used the oral method. And everybody has the right to choose their own education path and style of communication. For him, it really, really worked. And then he became a qualified physiotherapist. He also had the opportunity to star in a film, and the film is called Goya, the Ghost of Goya. And so, I auditioned. I was not selected, but they cast my brother. And so he's performed in a big, you know, in a film. He's starred alongside Anthony Banderas and other famous actors. So at the same time, he was studying, he was doing his qualification in college and having to commute to Spain every month for 9 months. So he's had an amazing experience. And again, it's all, you know, looking back to this very negative start in life where the adults and the medical profession put this very negative spin on a diagnosis of deafness. when you change your mindset, you realize, just how much is possible. So when I went back to Kuwait aged 17, it was a real shock to me to see just how much the mindset hadn't changed there. So for me, to be able to have achieved what I have is basically everything to do with my father. I've learned everything from him. Everything that I eventually became a bespoke tailor is because of my father. So I worked in Savile Row, which I think is a world famous. I worked alongside a tailor who was amazing with me. He was somebody who worked very closely with me. Um, my work here in London was in Savile Row was incredible. I then moved to Jaeger. Um, I also worked with DKNY and Giorgio Armani, and finally finished working at Harrods. So for 9 years, no, yes, 12 years, I worked in various big, designer label houses. I was very good at not just the design aspect, but also customer relations, working with, some very high profile people. It was an incredible experience. And again, all thanks to my father.
That's beautiful. Your father was a very smart man. God bless him.
Absolutely.
A couple of things. First of all, mindset is everything. So, whatever we put in here goes out. So I think that's number one. And if your father taught you that, that's the best lesson in life. Second of all, I have to name drop. I also worked with Antonio Banderas. How funny that your brother got to do a film with him. Very cool.
Yes, yes, I think that's right.
Yep.
Yes, Spanish. Spanish
Spanish.
himself, is that
Yes,
right?
yes, exactly. I also worked on a film with him too. I worked in Hollywood for a few years, a long time ago. But back to you.
Yeah, well, the pair of you know him more, more than I do. He got to meet so many different people. And, from the premiere as well, sort of being on the right red carpet, being
Mm.
able to see that all in action. I've never seen a deaf person in that context before. It was one of the first opportunities to do that. And Weil was like, how are you going to cope? I said to Weil, how are you going to cope with all the interviews? You're going to need an interpreter. And he was like, no, no, it's absolutely fine. But really, it's exhausting. So he was a little bit reluctant, but I explained actually, if you're trying to process what people are saying all the time, you're going to need somebody to be able to facilitate the communication for you. And they eventually agreed. But that time it was really rare to see somebody deaf using sign language on the screen. So it was a real achievement. I think now we see it a little bit more, which is great. But at that time, it was very exciting.
So, one thing, Firas, that I learned from you in our initial conversation was that every country has a different sign language. So, there's American Sign Language and then British Sign Language. And then I'm assuming, is it an Arabic Sign Language or does every country have its own sign language?
So every country has their own sign language. There's over 300 different sign languages. So, but across the MENA region, the 22 Arabic countries generally use the same Arabic sign language. They
Mm.
use one hand for the alphabet, but there are obviously going to be regional differences. There are some groups that have very similar um, signs for food. So you might have, for example, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria have very different signs from countries around Syria. The Gulf states, so Kuwait, Saudi, and Qatar and the Emirates, maybe, yes, the Emirati states and Bahrain. Um, those are the Gulf states. They're going to have a different version of Arabic. again, very related to the food. So you'll often see signs that are very different because the food is very different. So, as in every country, culture is very much, or food is very much part of culture. So, you know, there's, I know lots of people always say, oh, it's such a shame that there isn't just one sign language for all the deaf people in the world. And you say, well, yeah, but the same is true for spoken languages. Isn't it a shame that there isn't one language for everybody in the world? Spoken languages develop in their geographic regions in exactly the same way as signed languages develop geographically. And they are specific to their geography, their culture, their communities.
Wow. It's fascinating because I was one of those people that thought, oh, it must be one language where all deaf people can understand. But from you, I've already learned so much, Feras.
Yes, I think actually, sort of in the world, we have 72 million. I think it's 72 million, 72 million or billion, 72 million deaf people. So there's loads of us and
Mm,
impossible to know who we all are. Unfortunately, there are many, many deaf people who still experience that isolation and exclusion. The UK has improved. In some areas, it's better. But certainly the Middle East is still lagging behind in terms of attitudes. There are some places that I think, wow, it's still, 50 or 60 years behind where we've managed to get to. And I'm talking about, Oman, Saudi, Dubai. There are some places that are moving forward, but when you talk to people, they are quite resistant to doing anything.
mm.
They know that it's expensive to be able to um, maybe provide interpreters or to make those big changes. But for me, it's got to start from the ground up. So if you are able to invest in schools that provide good quality education for our deaf children, you are creating well-rounded, well-balanced, complete people. And I think about what's happened in Syria. When I think about when I was in Syria, it was just me and YL, and that can't be right. There must be many, many more deaf people out there. And so I had a conversation with my mum and said, what's happened? Where are all the deaf people in Syria? My mum was like, you're absolutely right. This is something I don't know about. You need to go out there and find out what's happening. My mum, as the mother of a deaf person, didn't know what was going on with other deaf children or other families who might have deaf children. So we spent some time trying to find deaf communities, whether it was, various meals that she'd been out, she might hear somebody's voice and be able to identify that person as maybe deaf just because of the way that they talked. So, my mum was able to find a way to be able to point us to, a little group of 7 people who were all having a conversation. We were able to go over and say, hi, we're deaf as well. And they were like, where are you from? And I said, from Syria. And they were like, no, impossible. You're from Sweden. You don't look like you're from Syria. And so I was like, no, come over and meet my mum. And so we were able to have this conversation around, what's going on for deaf people in Syria. And it was a really disheartening conversation because there are no opportunities, there are no resources. And at that point, I used to think about, what my father and mother must have gone through when they sent me to the UK as a 9-year-old. And I thank goodness for him. It broke their heart to have to send their child away. And it's such a shame that other families might have to do that. This is not something that is a punishment wrought on children because of the will of Allah or God or some other deity. This is just something that happens, and we need to change that culture. So once I'd finished working at Harrods for some time, one day I'd just come back to Harrods after visiting Syria, and I just had this voice in my head that said, you've got to go back. You've got to go back to Syria. And I don't know what it was. It was something spiritual. It was something really deep within me that meant that I had to go back to Syria to help the deaf people that I'd met. I had a conversation with Wael, my brother, and he was very positive, like, yes, we can do this. We can go back and we can make a difference. we can make a change for deaf people and their families. And so I had a opportunity to meet Mohammed Al-Fayed, who at that point was the owner of Harrods, be able to say, thank you for providing me with this opportunity, but I have to go back to Syria. And he was like, no, you've got to stay. I'll pay you more money. And I said, it's not the issue of the money. I've got to go back because I know that there are lots of deaf people suffering, and I'm somebody who can make a difference. And he accepted it. And I said, look, if I can, I'll come back. And he was very happy to hear that. So I think in 2006, I moved back to Syria, and that was an incredibly challenging experience. It was very hard to sort of compare the UK experience to the Syrian one. My mum had warned me and said, please don't think that this is something that you're going to be able to do overnight. It's not like you can just bring what you've learned from the UK and deposit it in Syria and it's going to work. That's not how it works. The culture here, they're going to be very suspicious of anybody who's just coming in and trying to impose things. You've got to do it the Syrian way. You're going to have to work in the Syrian way. And for 2 years, I had to shift my culture from the UK culture that I'd adopted back to the Syrian one. Everything I'd planned, they would say, no, we don't want this. So, unfortunately, the attitude there was that cochlear implants will solve everything, and that all children diagnosed with deafness, that they're automatically cured of their deafness, when the success rate for cochlear implants is incredibly low. And once you've implanted a baby, that's not the end of the story. So anyway, I'm getting sidetracked, but at that time, education for deaf children and deaf people was all about oral. Deaf children were expected to sit in a classroom while somebody was talking to them and understand and learn what was going on. So it broke my heart to see some of the things that I saw. It was an enjoyable time on the one hand, but it was really challenging. It was a big worry for me in terms of, how is the Syrian government different from the British government? And, at that time, well, I'm going to talk about the sign for Syria. This time we used this sign for Syria because it was the previous government. We have a different sign now. But the government at that point never gave an answer. They would say yes, and then sometimes they'd say no, and then they'd say yes, or it was, it's God's will or whatever. There was never a clear answer. So you had to be incredibly patient. And you had to be incredibly political because the government controlled everything. It was them that was going to give the final approval. Finally, I got to involved with a couple of NGOs, obviously for funding and for support, but we'd need the final sign off from the government. So after a few years of negotiation and conversation, they finally came around to my way of thinking that we needed to set up a school, an independent school that was independently maintained, not under the control of a government, because so far they hadn't managed to achieve it. It needed to be, needed to have experts, deaf role models, interpreters, professionals who would be able to come to Syria, conduct the research in the various different cities. So, for example, in Latakia as well, in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, in Hama as well, and in Dara. All of these different cities. It wasn't just in Damascus. We wanted to roll this project out across the country. We wanted children to be able to receive this education. None of the experts at that time were in Syria. So we needed to bring people in. We got the funding. We did all the visits. I can still remember those visits. They broke my heart. The programs were wrong. The teachers were wrong. They thought that what they were offering was working, but it wasn't appropriate for the children. It was an incredibly disappointing experience. But at the same time, I had, as I mentioned, managed to get in touch with some NGOs and some businesses who, from the region, were just incredulous that me as a deaf person was involved in leading, that I as a deaf person had a degree. And they would finally be on board to say, right, we need you to come in. We need you to be able to guide us, to educate us, to raise the awareness that we need in order to drive this project forward. So finally, after 2 years of building up this network and raising this awareness, I was able to get in. I organised a massive fundraising event. I managed to get in touch with an incredibly famous Arabic singer, and they were like, why would I want to do a concert for deaf people?" And I was very hurt by that. I think about, that as an opportunity that could have happened to open the door for us.
Mm.
But what happened was, actually, on the back of that, I got in touch with Bryan Adams, the famous Canadian singer. And this was because of my connections that I'd developed through Harrods and my brother's experience working in film. We were finally able to get in touch with Bryan Adams, who was on board straight away. He was going to come to Syria. He was going to perform a concert in 2010. This was just before the war started. So there was a lot of pressure on for us to get it done, for us to get it successful. It was a massive event with a massive name attached. We needed to find the right venue, sponsors. There were loads of negotiations to be involved in. Had luckily a lot of home networks and support to support me, people who were, helping me to make phone calls and texts and, drive cars and, get lots of business sponsorships. We had $700,000 ready to go for our deaf school as a result. This is what we were going to do with this money, was to set up the first Arabic school for deaf children in the Middle East. And then what happened? War broke out. And so at that point, everything was put on hold. And we thought, oh, well, maybe in a year or 2 years' time, after 6 months, after a year, the situation just got worse and worse and worse. So it was incredibly frustrating to have that dream just snatched away from us at the very last second. But I think sometimes people, whoever, knows that it's perhaps not the right time for whatever reason. So, it was very difficult, but I learned to accept it. And eventually I had to leave Syria at this time. But what happened was that the final decision to leave was because my brother, Wael, was arrested twice. And this is because the police in Syria thought that his hearing aid meant that he was a spy. So they arrested him twice. In fact, one of the times my friend saw it happen, there was an undercover agent said to Wael, "Come with me." And my brother's very trusting and friendly. He said, "Yeah, what's going on?" And they grabbed him, piled him into a car, and drove off. My friend had taken photographs, called us at home to say, "Please get to the station." We had to make a couple of phone calls to find where he was. That was the first event. The second event, we'd gone to like to the Turkish baths, the steam rooms and saunas. We thought we'd go and have a lovely time with friends and family before we were leaving. We were walking through the old centre, the old city. We were taking photographs, and the police approached Wael, grabbed him, and sort of bundled him into a minibus. My brother at that point knew that there wasn't something quite right, so he screamed. I didn't hear, obviously, but one of my other brothers heard, came running over, and I think it wasn't police at this point, it was the army, had got a bit of a shock because they didn't realise that Wael had friends or people with him. My brother then asked, "What's going on?" And they said, "Oh, we're very suspicious of him. We don't like him. We don't like his face. He's ugly. We're very suspicious of what he's doing." And so, there was no opportunity to discuss what photographs Wael had been taking. I think they were a bit suspicious that he'd been taking lots of photographs. So it was, a case of they were just going to do something and ask questions later. So it was very disappointing. We felt that we had to leave. We ended up in Dubai for 5 years. And again, I thought that Dubai would be the solution to all of my problems because it's very, very rich in comparison to Syria. So I thought, oh, we're going to get everything done. It'll happen in an instant. But again, for 5 years, we tried and tried and tried. And after 5 years, I had friends who said to me, "I think it's time to let this one go. I think at the moment it's just all talk." It's very frustrating again. They didn't listen, ironically, to the deaf people. And so I ended up coming back to the UK, and that's when I set up Deaf Accessibility. Again, because there is a lack of awareness and understanding about what deaf people's lives could be like. And so I wanted to make a difference here. I thought I'd be able to do something here. Um, COVID happened, and actually, it gave me time to think about what it was that I wanted to do. That's when I started working with Jill, and we worked on my website. We worked on lots of resources that I use in my training and teaching now. We sent out loads of emails to various schools and businesses to find out what it was that what it was that I wanted to do. Sent over 200 emails, maybe got one response that was positive. So again, it's for me the evidence that deaf people aren't the problem. It's people not listening to deaf people. And for me, I had to sort of think about what I offer and had to persuade people that me as a deaf person teaching hearing children sign language has benefits. So what I would do is offer a free lesson to say, I'll do a taster for you. I'll come in, I'll do half an hour. I'll teach them to fingerspell. I'll teach them some basic vocabulary like animals or family and colours. And after half an hour, you can get your teachers back in and you can see the results of just 30 minutes with me. And the teachers would come back in, and after 30 minutes, the children were signing and saying things like, I have two brothers and his name is, and spelling it, and realizing just how engaged and positive the children were. And that school then took me on for the first year. So it was thanks to that very first booking I have grown as a business and now teach across various different schools in London. I also do BSL clubs. I get lots of 6-week courses, and at the end the children keep saying, well, why are we stopping? And parents who say, why have the BSL lessons stopped? So we now have whole cohorts of children signing. We have I think there were children that I taught 3 years ago that I saw today who were straight in and were signing to me. I was like, calm down, calm down. They were, absolutely, they'd remembered everything. And again, for me, it's proof that deaf awareness and sign language needs to start young. And this is the solution to barriers. And so my frustration at the moment is getting hearing adults in power who make the decisions to understand this. I know from experience, I know what I suffered as a child. I'm not suffering anymore as a deaf person, but I know that there are still deaf people out there who suffer. And I know that one of the solutions is to teach hearing children sign language. So when they meet deaf adults in the future, they know what to do.
Well, Firas, I can say that you're definitely making a difference. And I am a firm believer of things happening at the right time. And unfortunately, when things don't happen the way that we wish they did, it's because there's something better along the way. And what you're doing is incredible. And I'm sure that one day you will go back to Syria and you will help the children, the deaf people, the deaf children that have been so neglected over there. Which,
I agree.
yes.
Absolutely. I will.
And speaking of, you recently went back to Syria. I do think it's quite fascinating that the sign for Syria changed when the regime changed.
Yes, so before we used to sign Syria like this, and now that we are free, we sign it like this, because this means that we are all equal and we are not under the control of the government anymore. I think before I was visiting Syria every year on a regular basis. And then the war started, it was much more difficult. I'd maybe go once every 4 years to see family. I'll have a British passport. If I fly to Syria and come back, there'll be lots of questions for me. Why were you in Syria? What were you doing? I would have to say I was visiting my family. It's my home. now we're open, the borders are open. As soon as they opened, we booked to go home. It was the 7th of April. I was booked to go back for 3 weeks. I had to fly to Beirut first at this point and then drive across the border to Damascus. I think for me, it was, the last time I was there was 5 years ago, and I can see there's been some massive changes. The army's gone, the police are gone. People are independent, free. The atmosphere is so much nicer. There's lots of shops that have closed. And so when I asked why, people would say the people who owned those shops were in league with the previous government and they've all fled. So the people there now, oh my goodness, the feeling is so much better. It's incredible. It's certainly back to the home that I knew. I can't begin to tell you the words. Of course, it needs time. It needs time to recover, needs time to build itself back up. I visited the Deaf Club, which was as sad as you can imagine. They've had no support for 14 years because of the war and the situation. I met a girl 7 at that time, so 14 years ago. So now she's 21, and she can't write, she can't speak. She just stays at home all the time. And for me, again, nothing has changed for the deaf children and the deaf community in Syria for the last 14 years. But now I am hopeful that things are looking positive. We have 23 new ministers in our government and in our cabinet. I happen to know some of them, or know the names, or know people who know them. I know that they have come back to Syria from living outside of the country for so long, so they're bringing back a different perspective. So I am hopeful.
And what is the plan? Are you going back anytime soon? What is Firas going to do in Syria to help the deaf children and community?
I will never give up on those deaf children. I made a promise to them. So I am hopeful that in 2030, so what are we now, 2025, so maybe earlier depending on how things go, but I'm thinking of a sort of 5-year plan. If we can get the approval from the current crop of ministers, then I'm hoping we'll be able to set something up. We'd have lots of maybes. You'll need to wait and see. When I tried before, but I'm hopeful that, given this new spirit at the moment and the fact that Syria may be considering recognizing Syrian Sign Language, that once we have that in place, we will have the momentum to drive forward more accessible arrangements for deaf people, schools, interpreters, and everyday provision of, for example, video remote services, support for families. If we can get their support for these raft of packages, once that has been approved, I will be there. And for me, it's about building this up the right way from the bottom up. It's the perfect time. I think I'm the perfect person. I have this experience here in the UK. I have my own cultural roots here. I know that we'd be able to, bring what we've learnt from the UK. We also have the support of the WFD, which is the World Federation for the Deaf, who fight very closely with the UN for the rights of deaf children and deaf adults. So the plan is to meet various ministers. I'm hoping to meet the new Minister for Social Affairs and Labour, Hind Kabawat. I was hoping to see her when I was there recently, but unfortunately she had to fly to the Vatican for the Pope's funeral, which of course is a very important thing. But I think, again, where Syria is a great example of a mixture of religions and cultures. I was also very lucky that one of the ministers approached me when I was there in Damascus. This is Abid Al-Salam Haikal. He's the Minister of Communications. And I didn't recognize him at first because he'd lost a lot of weight. And then when I finally realized who it was, he was like, "Oh, I'm Minister of Communications now." And this was just, for me, such a great thing. He knows me, he knows my family, he knows my background. Um, And when I met him in Abu Dhabi, he was very, very supportive. He was trying to encourage me to meet various other people in Abu Dhabi, which unfortunately didn't quite work out. There's another person in the cabinet who's the minister of, or he's in the Ministry for Economics. That's Sami Kiami. So I know him as well. He was the Syrian ambassador in London previously, and I'd met him a few times and been giving him lots of updates of my plan for school and the proposals that I had. The fourth person who I haven't met yet, but is the key to my plan, is the Minister for Education. This is Mohammed Abdul Rahman Turko. I haven't met him yet, but I want to arrange meetings with both him and Heen to be able to sit together to create this package that we need for both the social and educational welfare of deaf and deafblind people. I know that we can't jump or get too far ahead of ourselves because we have 14 years and all the time before that to be working on to improve, but I have the passion and the drive to be able to make sure that we have the foundations in place on which we can build. So I'm praying. I am very hopeful that they will be in touch and that I will be able to see them once I go back for another visit. I know that I need to be patient, but I also know that we need time for things to settle. They know I'm coming. I'm planning to go back in July and August, and I'm hopeful that we'll get those meetings in place then to get things going. I'm also hopeful. I have some great contacts in the UN. We have amazing support from some of their programs, and I'm hopeful that if we can get the approval across the board, it makes it much easier to then be able to say, right, we've got all of the official approval, and these are the people we now need to bring in to make this happen. You know, obviously, I've seen with my own eyes at least 400 deaf children with no school, no education, no books, no parents supporting, no parents, no support for the parents. And so, you know, there were two small girls, I think sort of 9 and 11, that have really, really amazing sign language skills at home that they've developed with their parents, but absolutely zero education, no access to education, which is heartbreaking.
Well, I know that you are going to do great things. Like your mother, I believe, said, things don't happen overnight, but with your determination and passion and persistence, I know you will achieve.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm really proud. My parents, you know, I wish other parents were like my parents. My parents weren't ashamed of us as deaf children. They didn't hide us away in the shadows. They were so supportive. I know that there are some attitudes that still exist around shame and embarrassment with children um, who are deaf, that, you know, it doesn't matter if they can't use their voice or not. Sign language is equally valid, and by having a language they can achieve just as much as hearing children. So there's a lot of work to be done around that, and I'm so proud that my parents had the attitude that they had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Firas, our time is kind of coming to an end. But before we go, because this is a podcast about the Arab world and Arabs, I have to ask you, what is a message that you would like to share with the West about Syria or the Arab world or about Arab people, something that you really want them to take away from this episode?
I think it's that you need to see the other side of the Arab world. There is so much negativity around Syria and various other Arab places, but I want you to think twice. Visit for yourself. People are warm and friendly and welcoming. They have an incredibly rich culture. I don't believe that it is a dangerous place for me. Social media is very sad to see the amount of negative stories. Whenever you see Syria in the news or on social media, it's always about the war. When I was there, it wasn't about that at all. It was about people having a lovely life and planning holidays and just going about their daily business. I know that people are suspicious and don't want to donate to projects to make life better for people there. So, what I want people to remember is that the suffering that you might see on one hand on social media is the result of 14 years of war and sanctions and lack of resources. But there is another side, particularly to Syria. It is time now. It's never too late. We think about the children now. So for me, it's about take a step back from what you see on social media, take a step back from the stories that you might read in the newspapers, because that is not all that we are about. Syria is so central. We're so central. We're so next door to so many different countries, Lebanon, so many different places that you could visit from Syria. It's a great central hub. So if you wanted to tick off lots of different countries within the Middle East, Syria would be a great place to use as your hub or your base to travel to other countries from. It's an ancient culture. It's an ancient country. It's an ancient city, and I think people would be astounded at the rich civilization and history that Syria has. It has amazing weather. It has amazing food, beautiful clothes, beautiful textiles. So I want people to think about those things rather than just focusing on the social media. I just have to ask one question, Julia. Is that okay? Before we close,
Yes.
for me, I would be very, very grateful, and I would hope you and my other friend that I did a podcast with, Sasha, would be perhaps interested in supporting a fundraising event that I would be happy to speak at. If we could get together and arrange something that people would perhaps buy tickets to attend, I would be happy to speak at. Perhaps we could come to put our brains together and come up with some way of raising some money to start putting towards this plan for deaf education in Syria. No
I
pressure. We can have a chat about that.
I would love to. I would love to help in any way possible. And it's a community that is completely neglected. People don't talk about. So I'm so glad that they have somebody like you to be a voice for them. And if I can help in any way, I would love to.
Brilliant. Thank you. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen the film that I made. There was a short film that I
Yes,
made.
I
Perhaps we
did.
could do a part two for that. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking of.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank
And
you.
and
Love to
also,
you.
Firas, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to our audience.
Yeah,
Hello.
that's up. That's the most type. That is like, people with me. We not have problem.
Thank you so much, Firas, for being here. Thank you. I
Welcome.
wish I knew a little bit more sign language. I know more. My sister taught my nephew when he was 6 months
That's all.
old.
Me, all.
More.
Yeah, so
Oh,
in ASL, that's more, and in BSL, this is
Let
more.
me,
So I'm going to
okay.
sign for you.
let me.
So
Okay.
in ASL and BSL, it's
That's you,
different.
America.
So in America,
Mother,
ASL,
father,
mother,
mother,
father,
father.
and BSL,
Okay.
mother,
Arabic,
father,
baba, mama.
and the Arabic Sign Language for
Okay.
those.
And I saw you did like Damascus. Oh,
Damascus.
Damascus,
Damascus.
yes,
Well,
Done.
yes,
you taught me Lebanon
Lebanon.
because
yes,
of the cedar trees.
Yes. Yes.
correct,
And
yes.
then
Saudi.
So this is Saudi,
Saudi.
Saudi.
Okay.
Saudi. Syria. Turkey.
Syria with the 3 stars.
Syria now with
Qatar.
the three. Amazing. Well, a lot of, or some of you may know that I am Lebanese and Syrian. And I'm actually going to take a trip to the Middle East with my mother and my sister later this year to Saudi and to the UAE. And my sister asked, is it safe to go to Syria? So I must ask you, is it safe to go to Syria right now?
Yes,
Everybody
don't worry.
moet fit right.
I
I
have
can't
many beautiful friends that I will recommend. I will share their names and they will take you round.
stay.
You will be
Fantastic.
safe. Your heart will burst with love and pride.
I believe you. And that,
Yes, thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much for interviewing me. Obviously, you know, podcasts are all about hearing. And so for you to be inviting a deaf person on as a little glimpse into the deaf world, absolutely amazing. And we have to think positive. We've got to get rid of all these negative thoughts.
yes. And by the way, it's Julie. And I know it in American Sign Language. It's Julie.
Okay.
Can you do it again for me?
Julie.
So in British Sign
Okay.
Language, this is the sign for name.
Me.
So my name, but the grammar's different. So this is J. You draw the J on your hand.
You.
U is your pinky.
I.
That's L.
I.
I is your middle finger.
E.
And E is your index finger. There you go.
Yay. Is this clapping as well? Because I know this is clapping in ASL.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so that's
Yes.
international. That's going to work for
Thank you,
any deaf
Lord.
person because just like all hearing people clap, and that's sort of across cultures for deaf people across cultures. Yes, that's the applause.
Got it. And Firas and Jill, before you go, where can people follow you or donate, or if they want to take BSL classes, how do they get in touch with you or where do they follow you?
So you can email me. So that's Firas at Deaf Accessibility. You can have a look on the defaccessibility.com. So you can have a look on my website, defaccessibility.com. I think my email address is there, and that will be the best way to get hold of me. I'd be
Perfect.
happy to have a conversation with anybody. I think it's really important that people, if they think about I think it would be quite nice to have a conversation. Don't think about it, just do it. You know, don't delay. Think about it. Think about the future. Think about the change that you can make.
I love it. Thank you so much, Firas. Thank you so much for Jill. Thank you so much for Jill. Thank you so much, Jill, for coming on the podcast. Thank you. And Firas, definitely write me about whatever I can do to help. I'd love to help the community. And until next time, thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, we can do this again anytime. Part 2. What happened
Part two.
next?
Yes. Okay.